a selection pressure all the way.
So there isn't a process, as it were, going on in the cell saying, look, be patient.
No.
It's going to be a feather, believe me.
Yes. Sidney Brenner satirized that beautifully when he said he imagined some protein arising in the Cambrian, which was kept because it might come in handy in the Cretaceous. It doesn't happen like that. There's got to be a series of advantages all the way in the feather. If you can't think of one, then that's your problem, not natural selection's problem. Natural selection, well, I suppose that is a sort of matter of faith on my part, since the theory is so coherent and so powerful. You mentioned feathers. I mean, it's perfectly possible that feathers began as sort of fluffy extensions of reptilian scales to act as heat insulators. And so the final perfection of sort of wing feathers that we see in flying birds might have come very much later, and the earliest feathers might have been a different approach to hairiness among reptiles, keeping them warm. Over and over again, we come across cases where an organ starts out doing one thing and then gets modified to doing another thing. But it's not very useful to challenge an individual biologist's ingenuity in thinking up what particular intermediates might have looked like, because we don't, I mean, maybe we're just not ingenious enough to think what they are. I should have thought there's a more general argument, which is that we shouldn't in any case be saying, oh, I can't think what the explanation for it is, therefore it must have been designed. There's a fatal weakness in any argument which says, I cannot understand how X could have happened, therefore it must have been designed. It would be as if you took a famous scientific discovery, I mean, I think of Hodgkin and Huxley's working out of how the nerve impulse works, a very difficult problem involving very tough mathematics. Suppose that they found it too difficult. Would we have respected them if they'd said something like, I can't work out how this nerve impulse works, Hodgkin, can you? No, Huxley, I can't. Let's just give up and say God did it. It's that element of giving up, it's that element of defeatism, saying, I can't understand how it works, therefore let's fall back on the design explanation.
Yes, even if it doesn't take the form of explicit conscious design on the part of a creator, one of the ideas which seems to me to be the counterpart of what you're saying was the invoking of the vital principle in
absolutely.
the 19th century.
But, I mean, vital principles, force locomotive, none of them explain anything. They're just redescriptions of the problem. But they're pernicious because people think they explain something. It sort of vaguely sounds as though it explains something, and people are so used to the idea that complicated things in our human world are indeed designed and made. But when you've said, oh, it was designed by God, you've explained absolutely nothing, because you're left with the problem of explaining where the designer came from. And so it's a non-explanation. We shouldn't even regard it as a candidate explanation.
Why do you think it was that for really very intelligent biologists to invoke something which we can see now, and it's surprising that they couldn't see then, was such a vacuous explanation as the vital principle to account for the spontaneity of living things?
Well, I suppose it's all very well for us to say we can see that it's nonsense, but when you didn't have anything better, I mean, I could imagine in the time of Hume, for example, he would have said, this is a bad explanation, and he was right. But he didn't actually have a better one to put in its place. And so you have to be quite intellectually courageous to stick on the philosophical point that it's clearly a bad explanation. And I think that in a real sense it had to wait for Darwin, who produced a deeply satisfying explanation. I mean, it would have been wonderful if Hume would have been simply captivated to have heard Darwin's explanation, I suspect.
For Richard, then, the theory of evolution provided support for his growing disbelief. But I wanted to know why, atheism was such a pressing issue for him. Why is this argument so important at this point in the 21st century when you and I can see that it's a settled issue, and yet we find ourselves in an embattled position? And why is the argument so important?
As a scientist, to me it's important because I do regard the hypothesis of a supernatural designer as a scientific hypothesis. I think it's a wrong one, but it actually is science. One can't... I don't have much patience with theologians who say, well, we're really not disagreeing, it's just that religion concerns itself with morality and science concerns itself with the way the universe is, and there's no problem between them. To me, there is a problem, because the moment you talk about a supernatural creator, designer, anything, you are advancing a scientific hypothesis, which is either right or wrong. I mean, a universe that has a supernatural intelligence, a supernatural overmind in it, is a very, very different kind of universe from a purely scientific point of view than a universe which hasn't. And it's a very, very interesting difference. I mean, it's a massive difference. And I think it's scientifically interesting to hold a view of the universe which I do, which is that there is no supermind. Well, there may be minds far superior to ours, but they will also have come into existence through a slow, gradual, incremental process. They were not there from the start. People who hold the opposite view, that there was a supernatural intelligence right from the start, responsible for it all, are advancing a very, very diametrically different scientific hypothesis, which has got to be either right or wrong. Even if we can't finally decide whether it's right or wrong, we must at least admit that it is a different hypothesis, very different hypothesis, and therefore it matters.
But I often encounter religious people who argue in the following way. They'll say, well, it's not really, and we don't think of it as a scientific hypothesis. We think of it as something which involves a leap of faith. In other words, that it's not something which they say can be proved right or wrong. There's no way in which it can be proved right or wrong, because it belongs to a domain of existence and entities about which that sort of proof, disproof, and research are irrelevant. There is something which they call the leap of faith, which identifies you with this creator.
Well, that sort of thing just leaves me cold. I mean, I can't really even begin to empathise with it. I understand that it may be in principle impossible to demonstrate one way or the other, so there may be no scientific test you could ever do to decide the question, and that I could believe. But to me, that still leaves the point that it either is true or it isn't. A leap of faith which just means that a person has a sort of internal feeling of revelation which is not shareable with anybody else and which can't be demonstrated to anybody else. To me, that just sounds like a mental delusion.
Why is it then that people actually invoke the notion of a leap of faith, not as a weakness on their part, but as some sort of virtue which is lacking in people like you and me?
Well,
that there is some sort of peculiar willingness, and a willingness which indicates some sort of spiritual generosity, which we somehow don't have.
Well, I mean, first thing, I think it's important to stress, in view of our earlier conversation, that the kind of person you're now talking about is a very much more sophisticated animal than the sort who argues about creationism and that kind of thing, because those people really would think that there was some intervention by the deity in the world. But your people with their internal revelation presumably accept that their God doesn't actually intervene in the world. Otherwise, they would have to concede that it is a scientific hypothesis. So the domain in which he works, or it works, seems to be a rather strangely detached from the world domain, purely concerned with internal feelings that people privately have.
But the implication is that it's a domain from which we are unfortunate enough to be excluded.
That's right.
And that, as I said, that it's a lack of some sort of talent, generosity, or blindness
Yes.
on our part, which cuts us off from the beauty and majesty of this domain.
Like not knowing what it's like to fall in love or something.
Yes.
Being deprived, being deficient in some important way. Yes, I mean, I can understand that, and I actually could imagine that we're not so deprived as... I mean, because you and I probably do have feelings that may very well be akin to a kind of mystical wonder when we contemplate the stars, when we contemplate the galaxies, when we contemplate life, the sheer expanse of geological time. I experience, and I expect you experience, internal feelings which sound pretty much like what mystics feel, and they call it God. And I've been called a very religious person for that reason. If I am called a religious person, then my retort to that is, well, you're playing with words, because what the vast majority of people mean by religious is something utterly different from this sort of transcendent mystical experience. What they mean is an entity which interferes in the world, which actually has some kind of impact upon the world and therefore is a scientific hypothesis. The transcendent sense, the transcendent mystic sense that people who are both religious and non-religious, in my usage of the term, is something very, very different. In that sense, I probably am a religious person. You probably are a religious person. But that doesn't mean we think that there is a supernatural being that interferes with the world, that does anything, that manipulates anything, or, by the way, that it's worth praying to or asking forgiveness of sins from, etc.
But once we concede that, I know this is what I call the clergyman in the laurel bushes, that as soon as one makes any concession in the direction of wonder or a sense of majesty and mystery, and it's not confined to the large things, I mean, just simply contemplating mitochondria,
yes,
or produces the same sort of Blakean feelings that he had from grains of sand.
Exactly.
The clergyman in the laurel bushes leaps out and says,
yes,
you are one of us after all.
Exactly. It's happened to me over and over again. I think it's deeply dishonest, and I think it's fooling around with words and not understanding or not honestly dealing with the way ordinary people use words. And so I prefer to use words like religion, like God, in the way that the vast majority of people in the world would understand them, and to reserve a different kind of language for the feeling that we share with possibly your clergyman in the laurel.
But, I mean, as soon as one does admit that, and admits the unknowability of things, there is always the implication from the religious, not necessarily from the orthodox religious, but the people who are susceptible to energies and vibrations and aromas and so forth, to the idea that, what they often say, there must be something.
Well, okay, I mean, it just doesn't follow. It's just.
Well, my answer to them when they say there must be something, and I always say, well, yes, there is. It's everything.
Yes.
It's there without any super added.
Yes. I mean, I think I would hit back harder than that, actually, and say that the sense of wonder that one gets as a scientist contemplating the cosmos or contemplating mitochondria is actually much grander than anything that you will get by contemplating the traditional objects of religious mysticism.